US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping met for the very first time in over a year in a mountainside resort in California on the sidelines of the Apec summit. There were a lot of issues at stake, from geopolitical rivalry, China's aggressive behavior in the Indo-Pacific, to critical emerging technologies, and of course the most important question of all, Taiwan. All eyes were on this meeting, which happened in the Fioli Historic Home and Garden, which is a 56-room mansion which used to host some of the most legendary Hollywood parties in the early 20th century.
I value our conversation because I think it's paramount.
President Biden said after the meeting that his talks with President Xi Jinping brought important progress in stabilizing the relationship between the two major powers. He also vowed that the two leaders would try and resolve all future disagreements by picking up the phone rather than pushing their countries to the edge of conflict.
We haven't always agreed, which was not a surprise to anyone, but our meetings have always been candid, straightforward, and useful. I've never doubted what you've told me in terms of your candid nature in which you speak. I value our conversation because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication. We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict. And we also have to manage it responsibly, that competition. That's what the United States wants and what we intend to do. I also believe it's a world wants for both of us, candid exchange. We also have a responsibility to our people and the work in the world to work together when we see it in our interest to do so.
Emerging after hours of talks with Xi Jinping outside San Francisco, Biden told reporters that the conversation had been the most constructive and productive between the two world leaders in their time in office. They also announced some modest agreements to resume military communications and also to stop the spread of fentanyl, which is an opioid drug that has killed many thousands of Americans. But the meeting did not produce any major breakthrough. It also left many issues unresolved. We are in a competitive relationship, China and the United States, Biden said at a news conference following that meeting. But he also added that his responsibility is to make this rational and manageable so that it does not result in conflict. That is what I'm all about, and that is what this is about, to find a place where we can come together and find mutual interests, unquote. Here are the two modest agreements that were arrived at in the California meeting. One on closing down Chinese operations supplying precursors for a chemical called fentanyl, which is an opioid drug which is made in anti-cancer treatment. And also another one, an agreement on resuming military-to-military contacts. The U.S. expects the military hotline to begin very soon, starting between the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and his Chinese counterpart, when a Chinese counterpart is appointed, and then after that, it will go down to the level of U.S. Pacific commandos. The previous Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu was sacked after an internal scandal, and the United States is waiting for an appointment of a successor to Li Shangfu so that this military hotline can become active again. But just as he was leaving this news conference, Joe Biden was asked a very tricky question on whether he believed what he had said earlier, that he views Xi Jinping as a dictator, a term that he used at a campaign fundraiser earlier this year. And this is what Biden said. Well, look, he is. Adding that here's a guy who runs a country that is a communist country.
Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours.
Taiwan remains the biggest point of contention between the two countries. There are elections due early next year in a small island nation of 20 million. The presidential elections are due in January. That'll be an early test of the US-China relationship in the new year. Biden and his aides are watching for what China intends to do. Will it engage in cyber interference in the Taiwan elections? Will it try and use military means, possibly lobbing some missiles around Taiwan to try and scare the Taiwanese people into voting for a party that is more favorable, more amenable to China? There are also reports that the incumbent party, the DPP, which is also pre-independence and the most anti-China of all the mainstream parties in Taiwan, may find a surprise at the hustings with the coming together of some of the opposition parties in a joint bid to surprise the DPP. Taiwan also played a role in the resumption of mill-to-mill ties. Biden, in fact, said that the United States and China had agreed to resume military-to-military communication to avoid miscalculations on either side and avoid any kind of accidents. He is framing the re-establishment of the hotline between the two defense ministers as a breakthrough. But these talks at the mill-to-mill level have existed since the administration of President George W. Bush in the early 2000s. They were cut off after former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan last year, which was controversial in and of itself. China had taken great umbrage to that trip. Asked if he trusted Xi Jinping on his willingness to regulate fentanyl exports to the United States from China, another exchange that Biden framed as a diplomatic achievement of the summit, this is what he said: "Trust but verify, as the old saying goes. That's where I am. We're in a competitive relationship and my responsibility is to make this rational and manageable so that it does not result in conflict." Now, the absence of any mention of climate change was stark, especially as both countries were at the forefront of the Paris COP agreement in 2015, but there's been precious little progress thereafter. It's also been a bit of a dampener right ahead of the COP28 summit, which is due to happen in Dubai next month. Nothing has been done to rein in China's rapid expansion of coal-fired power plants. It is truly stunning that Biden, in his press remarks, did not even mention climate change, because it really undercuts his administration's insistence that they see climate change and combating it as a key foreign policy and national security goal. Also missing from that list of accomplishments was any dedicated channel to discussing limiting the use of artificial intelligence, particularly when it comes to autonomous weapons, including nuclear weapons, and of course in the military arena. China was not ready for a formal channel to discuss AI, saying that it would likely continue in talks between the National Security Advisor of the US, Jake Sullivan, and his Chinese counterpart. In fact, in this case, it would be the Chinese top Foreign Office official, Wang Yi. Now, Xi Jinping expressed frustration over US investment and export controls into China, saying that they have seriously damaged China's legitimate interests. This was according to a Chinese state media release that was put out after the meeting. Washington has cut off Chinese access to advanced US semiconductor technology. It's also restricted investments into sensitive areas of national security grounds, and that has deprived the Chinese people of their right to development, according to this readout put in the Chinese media. That's what Xi Jinping told his US counterpart. Now, it was not all about critical technology or North Korea or nuclear weapons. At one point during their 4-hour meeting, Joe Biden wished Xi Jinping's wife, Peng Liyuan, a happy birthday. In fact, she shares the same birthday as the President of the US, who turns 81 years old next week. Xi Jinping replied to Joe Biden that he was embarrassed because he had been working so hard and so much that he had forgotten that his wife's birthday was coming up. All in all, it was an important meeting of the fact that they met in and of itself, more than what actually resulted out of that meeting, because the agreements out of the meeting were rather modest on fentanyl exports and curbing them, and also the military-to-military contact, which was already there prior to the 2022 visit of Nancy Pelosi. But this visit is not going to be judged so much so by the agreements or the lack of it at the end of this visit. It is going to be judged by the future trajectory of US-China ties, and particularly when it comes to Taiwan. If the elections pass off peacefully, and even if a pro-China, pro-reunification party gets to power in Taipei, how the United States responds and how China responds to this will be worth watching. If tensions do exacerbate in the Taiwan Straits, both in the run-up to and post the elections, then you can be rest assured that in an election year, not just in Taiwan, but also in the United States, there will be frictions galore all through 2024. But if they manage this relationship well, as Biden's aim was, and he explicitly said so right after the meeting, if they manage this relationship well, both in the run-up to and during the course of Taiwan elections, then there is hope that 2024 may not be such a bad year in ties between Beijing and Washington.